It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor William McCarthy from the University of California. I won't say much about him, already written over here, his introduction. I would just say that it has always been a great delight to interact with, we fondly all call him Bill, to interact with Bill and hear his opinions and hear his advice. So it's a great privilege really to have him in this symposium and hear him. And as Ritesh has already said, that he has been a mentor to him, and we can see how the whole thing has turned out and evolved. So welcome, Professor William McCarthy, to this symposium, and look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Dr. P.C. Gupta. It's been an intellectual delight to interact with you and your staff at Siksaria, at Helis Siksaria Institute. And it's a privilege to present to the 5th National Conference on Tobacco or Health. So the title here is Religiosity, Gender and Adolescent Intention. You might say, religiosity? What does that have to do with tobacco control? Well, as we can acknowledge, religions are a major vehicle for transmitting cultural values across generations. And we have found in the United States that there is a relationship between adolescent religiosity and protection from tobacco use of all kinds. And so I wondered, given the experience in the United States, whether we could see similar relationships in India, where the religions, the dominant religions, are quite different. In the United States, it's Christianity, and in India, the two major religions are Islam and Hinduism. Next slide. So I do have to acknowledge that other colleagues have contributed to this presentation. You've seen these names before, so let's move on. Next slide. So as mentioned, religiosity has been inversely associated with adolescent intention to smoke cigarettes in the US. The most common question asked of adolescents with respect to religiosity has been the question, how often do you go to church or to another place of worship? And so we thought to ask this question, but also some additional questions that we will get into. There are various ways for measuring religiosity. And the implication is, if there is a relationship, that this provides a different avenue than has been used in the past. Instead of always relying on schools, sometimes we might look at other institutions for transmitting appropriate attitudes and norms concerning tobacco use. So next slide. So we examined religiosity, as I mentioned, as a frequency of prayer, importance of prayer, and frequency of going to a place of worship. And we're using the cross-sectional sample that you've heard described in the two previous presentations. Next slide. So we've talked about the longitudinal cohort study, and that it was interviewer administered and computer assisted. And so here it's just to note that among the other questions asked on the survey, there were questions concerning what religion do people associate with, and various questions about religiosity. Next slide. So the primary outcome measures were two. One had to do with smoking tobacco, and the other was smokeless tobacco, chew or applying tobacco. Next slide. So the questions concerning religious affiliation and religiosity are the following. What is your religion? And the answer options were Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, and other. And that, as you might expect, the proportion who said Hindu were 3/4 or more. Muslim was close to 20%. And then all the rest were quite low, all below 5%. Buddhists, I think, were 3%. Jain were 2%. Christians and Sikhs were respectively 1% across the whole survey. The religiosity measure, the first one was, how often do you pray? And the answer options were never, 1 to 3 times a year, 1 to 3 times a month, 1 to 3 times a week, and nearly every day. The second religiosity measure was, how important is prayer at home to you? answer options were not at all important, somewhat important, very important. And then the third religiosity item was the one that has been used most often in the United States. And that's how often do you go to temple, mosque, church, or other place of worship? Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, good. So the analytical approach was to take the tobacco use intention measures, which are good predictors of subsequent tobacco use among adolescents, and we dichotomized them. For those adolescents who said definitely not, which were the vast majority, we assigned a 0. And then for all the other options, we assigned a 1, even if they said, well, maybe not. The fact that they weren't sure indicated to us that they were probably more vulnerable than the average adolescent. And then the covariates are gender, age, and religious affiliation. And all of this was using logistic analyses. Because of the short time that I had to present, I'm collapsing across the 2 major cities in which we collected the data, Mumbai and Kolkata. But just as you saw in the previous presentations, there are differences between the 2 cities. Next slide. So here are the baseline characteristics with respect to this presentation. And what's noteworthy is, the large differences between Hindu, Muslim, and other. And other, note that in Mumbai, other includes Buddhists and Sikhs and Jain and Christians. And Kolkata may be a reflection of their less cosmopolitanism than in Mumbai, that only 1% were other. Next slide. So here are the primary outcomes, results, and as previously mentioned by previous presenters, most of the adolescents that we have surveyed so far, because of their youth, have not yet adopted any kind of smoking or smokeless tobacco use. So that's why we had to ask, whether they intended, and most said definitely not, because they're not using. It's noteworthy that girls, and this is very consistent with US data, girls were more likely than boys to say, oh, no way, I definitely would not use tobacco in the next 12 months. Okay, what we have here is frequency of prayer at home. So that's a major predictor. And girls were 10.8% more likely than boys to say that they prayed daily. But the majority were praying quite frequently, more so than we found with US adolescents. Interestingly enough, Muslims were 17.6% and 11.6% more likely, respectively, than Hindus to say that they prayed daily and that they considered prayer at home to be very important. And so if our hypothesis is correct, that religiosity is protective, then we would expect that there might be a difference between Muslims and Hindus based on these results. Next. So here we are looking at intention either for smokeless or smoking. So smoking is on the right. There was an overall inverse association between frequency of prayer and intention to use smokeless tobacco. That's as we suspected, that was our hypothesis. And figures 2 and 3 show that this effect was seen in Hindu students, but not in Muslim students. Muslim students were pretty uniformly not intending to use tobacco in any form, whereas Hindu adolescents were a little more variable, and the other religions were quite a bit more variable. Next slide. So this is the question of how important is prayer, and here we find that there's quite a difference. In fact, those who said that prayer is not at all important were more than 3 times more likely to report intending to smoke or chew tobacco than the respondents who said that prayer was only somewhat important or very important. And we did note that when stratifying by religious affiliation, this effect was replicated in Muslim, but not Hindu students. And gender did not moderate these associations. Next slide. So there was no association between tobacco use and frequency of attendance at a temple or a mosque. So this is quite different from what we have seen in the United States. Next slide. So to conclude, the implication is, if we confirm with the prospective longitudinal data that are being collected and will be collected, if we confirm what we see in the cross-sectional data, then it looks like religiosity may be an additional vehicle by which we can argue, persuade adolescents not to use tobacco. So, if it's true, then we can collaborate with the faith community and perhaps use religiously themed messages to motivate local youth to avoid tobacco. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor William McCarthy, for that very interesting and very new kind of presentation as far as I think Indian data are concerned. This is for the first time such a question has been investigated. Thank you very much.